Good afternoon, everyone, and a very happy Thursday to everyone, no matter where you're joining us from. It's great to be talking to you all at another Thursday lunchtime lecture from us here at the Church's Conservation Trust. I'm really excited that we are once again joined by Dr. Emma Wells, who's going to be talking to us about the gory and gruesome history of relics. But we'll be telling you more about that shortly. But as always the case, the first 10 minutes of these lectures we dedicate to Church of the Week, which is where we explore one of the 356 historic churches in our care at the Church's Conservation Trust, in which has a connection to the topic of the lecture of the week. Now, normally it'd be our chief executive who does that, or failing that, it'd be my manager, Shana James. Neither of them there, so I'm holding the fort today. So bear with me, because I'm going to be doing everything today. So I'm just going to share my screen, and I'm going to talk to you all about this week's Church of the Week. So just bear with me. There, hopefully that is sharing for everyone. So firstly, I would like to thank Ecclesiastical Insurance for sponsoring Church of the Week and for their support of our lunchtime lecture series. We really are most grateful for their support and sponsorship of these lectures. Today's church is one that I've not yet had the pleasure of visiting, but I'm looking forward to getting there one day. And it's a historic church in Kent, and it's at St. Mary's, Fordwich. People have lived at Fordwich, which means inhabited place by the fords, since at least 675 AD. When it was first recorded. Now, it claims to be England's smallest town, and with a population of less than 300, it's tiny in comparison with most modern towns today in England. It was, however, a burgh in Saxon times, and King Henry II granted it the status of a borough, which it enjoyed until 1886. It also served as the port for Canterbury. So it was quite an important place and a place of traffic during the Middle Ages. Now, over the course of 900 years, people from many periods have left their mark upon St. Mary's. Much has been done over the past 150 years to maintain and beautify it. Now, the north aisle, which is typical in Kentish fashion, has its own gabled roof. Now, you can see the north aisle, that's on the right-hand side. It's got the red bricks there, and that's the north aisle. And this was originally, we believe, added in around 1200. Now, if so, the two earlier Norman slit windows, one at the west end and the other at the north wall, may have been reused from the former north nave walls that would have once existed. Their semicircular heads are made out of single blocks of stone, indicating 11th century work. Now, if you've been to some of our other churches, so I'm just thinking here, Inglesham and Suffolk, you can see where the later medieval period, when they've rebuilt naves and put on additional aisles, they've reused earlier stonework, and that's the case here as well, we believe. Now, the aisle's free light east window, which you can see, is probably given is that which was paid for in a will, and that was the will of John Ansell, and now he died and left his money in 1503. The gable above it has been restored with 16th and 17th century bricks. Now, St. Mary's is set quietly back from the crossroads and a tiny square. Only its shingled spire may be seen from any distance, because the church is almost completely hidden by trees which surround it, and in which the shade, which creates a lovely shaded and attractive peaceful churchyard. Now, to the south of the church are several interesting 18th century gravestones, displaying fine carvings of the period. A group to the west of the porch includes the headstones for Henry Brown, which you can see here, who was a curate who died in 1720. And then it's to a bit further away from it is the grave of his wife, who was called Elizabeth, who died a few years before him in 1706. And both of them have skull and crossbones on them, and that symbolize human mortality, or memento mori, sometimes they're referred to. St. Mary's is memorable for its mellow and largely unspoilt interior, containing workmanship from several periods of history reflecting the different Christian traditions of those who have used it over the years. The roofs contain medieval timber work. The nave has a plaster ceiling, but its roof is supported by crown posts which rise from tie beams. Now, the arcade, or rather the three arched openings which pierce the north nave wall, are very simple indeed. Now, you can see those, you can just see the organ coming through one of the arches. So you can just see a bit of the stonework there for the other nave arch on the north wall. But those are really interesting. So A, they're quite simple, but their only embellishments are the stone imposts at the springing of the crude arches, which you can just see those little, where the arch shots spring out from the straight the vertical, it then starts to curve in. You can just see a little, almost looks like a little plinth. And that's where it starts to spring out. Now, this would suggest that they can't be much later than 1200 AD in date. Now, let's go and have a look in the chancel. Now, the present choir stalls were given by Dean and Chapter of Canterbury Cathedral in 1938, but the 17th century communion rails are still in place, and you can see those just before the altar. And the reason why they're there is because in the 1630s, Archbishop Laud ordered that altars should be provided with communion rails so that dogs should not defile the sanctuary. In the 18th century, the lower part of the sanctuary walls received their present wainscot lining, and the wooden altarpiece, which is behind the altar, or otherwise also called a reredos, was made and inscribed with the 10 Commandments, flanked by the Lord's Prayer and Apostles' Creed. And you can see there's a later edition of artwork that was added later. Now, I want to show you the east window, because the east window is particularly fine in this church. Now, this contains a very colourful scene of the Annunciation, and it's 20th century in date, and it was made by Martin Travers. Now, earlier this year, we did a lunchtime lecture on Travers. He's a really important figure, artist and architect in the Anglo-Catholic revival, or certainly in Anglo-Papalism, and some of his best work you can see at St Mary's, Bourne Street in London, but this is one of the churches where we've got some of his work. Now, it's dramatically portraying the figure's Archangel Gabriel. You can see the Archangel Gabriel there, and this beautiful patterned cope. You can see a lovely square morse securing the cope around his neck there. And to obviously on the right of Gabriel, you can see Our Lady. You can also see God, who's symbolized there. You can see the God descending there from the Alpha and Omega. Then we've got the depiction of the Holy Spirit coming down on the Virgin Mary. The window was made in memory of Reverend Richard Hitchcock, who was rector at this church from 1893 until his death in 1931. So he was a rector for a very long time, and he was rector during the First World War here. Now, what's interesting is that his predecessor, the Reverend Edward Brailsford, was rector for 41 years here, and he certainly would not have approved of this window. He was an extreme Protestant who in 1873 wrote and published an open letter to the then Archbishop of Canterbury entitled Incipient Idolatry in the Church of England, berating the vicar of nearby Surrey for having a reredos erected in his church with a highly objectionable representation of Jesus on the cross with his mother and St. John nearby. Now, lots of people know that I really like talking about the Anglo-Catholic churches because I think they're beautiful churches to go on. So I think it's safe to say that me and Reverend Edward Brailsford would not have seen eye to eye. Now, here you can see a really important brass memorial in this church. Now, I'm just going to quickly tell you a bit about it. Now, this is the central nave gangway of the church, and it's a Prix Aphra Hawkins. Now, she died in 1605. She was aged 21. Now, above her, the inscription, you can see the effigy. So we've got the inscription there on the right, her effigy, and then we've got her coat of arms above. But if you're on the left, you can see that beautiful how the ruff and the dress of her time, showing her in the latest fashions, how she's depicted there. But onto a final slide, why I chose to do Forgery as Church of the Week this week. Now, the aisle is really interesting because it has leaning walls, but if you go just west of the small doorway in the aisle, you'll see what's called the mysterious Forgery stone. Now, this is a fine carved piece of stone from around circa 1100, and it's interlaced Norman arch. So you can see those arches going along, they're interlaced there, they're Norman. And they're believed scaly decorations in a great block of oolitic limestone. Now, this measures about 5.5 feet long, or 1.7 meters long in length. And it was removed from the west wall of the church to the churchyard, can you believe it, in 1760. And then it was then moved from the churchyard to Canterbury Cathedral before it was later returned from the cathedral in 1877 to the church. Now, what's interesting, I think, about this is that it was almost, at Canterbury, it was referred to as St. Augustine's tomb. Now, it most certainly was a shrine. It was fashioned to resemble a dummy tomb beneath which were placed the relics of a saint. And we don't know, but they may have even been those of St. Augustine. It may have been just a sliver of a relic or some of a saint, but this was clearly once a shrine. But that, everyone, is Church of the Week, and that was St Mary's in Fordwich. So I'm just going to stop my screen share and come back into Zoom. So everyone, that was Church of the Week. Normally we have question times with Chief Executive, but as I said, he's not here today, and it's me holding the fort. So there won't be any questions, you'll be pleased to know, and we're going to get on with the lecture very shortly. But a warm welcome to everyone today joining us for the first time. You're most welcome. These lectures are always free of charge, and we make recordings of them, and you can catch up on any of our previous lectures completely free of charge, either on our Facebook page, we've got a Facebook lecture playlist, or on our YouTube channel. I'll post a link later on where you can get access to those free playlists. Now, if you enjoy these lectures, we do ask that you consider making a donation, and there's a few ways that you can support us. As I said, we look after 356 historic churches across England at the moment, and we're taking 2 additional churches into our care this year, and that number may rise over the coming years as a result of the COVID pandemic. But our collection is growing, and it's really important that we're so grateful for your support in helping us care for our collection of churches. Now, you can donate in a couple of ways. You can do it through our website, which is completely secure. And our website is visitchurches.org.uk. You can also send a donation by text. Now, if you have your mobile phones to hand, all you do is you text the word CCT to 70331, and that will give us a gift of £5. Now, there is another way that you can support us, and that's by becoming a member of the Trust. Now, if you join us by direct debit, and if you use the offer code LECTURE, and that's just the word lecture in capital letters at checkout, if you do that, you'll get a free copy of this book, which is The Secret Language of Churches and Cathedrals, which was written by a previous lunchtime lecturer of ours, Dr. Richard Stemp. I say it every week, but it is a really fantastic book, and I'll let everyone else who's already got their free book tell you how good a book it is. But there's other benefits to being a member as well. Not only do you get to get a free copy of this if you use that offer code and join by direct debit, you also get a members magazine several times a year, you get regular updates, and you get behind the scenes access to some of our conservation work, invitations to private events, as well as special offers and access, also access to our exclusive member series of lectures that we started a few months ago. Now, if you have any technical problems at all during the lecture, just comment away or send me a direct message. I'll be keeping an eye on the chat today, so don't worry. But also, if you've got any questions for Emma, please do comment away. And what we'll do is at the end of the lecture, we always have time for questions. So I'll put your questions to Emma at the end of the lecture. But I'm really delighted to be introducing once again Dr. Emma Wells, who's done several lunchtime lectures for us in the past, and I'm really excited about today's lecture. So without any further delay, Emma, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'll just share my screen. Okay. So, well, thank you for that introduction, George. Now, of course, you might think today's paper is simply going to be a detailed dive into the macabre underpinnings of the world of the cult of relics throughout the medieval era. Actually, it's far from that. Now, it's not quite clickbait, but though the title alludes to the sometimes rather gory, I suppose we could call it, aspect of various relics throughout history, think fingernails, hearts, fingers, etc. In fact, today's paper is going to look at just why this was all important and how it came to be, and therefore how the significance of the cult of relics led to a growing enterprise which fueled the growth of the Catholic Church throughout Western Christendom, and indeed in many ways led to a great number of problems too in the 16th century and perhaps even earlier. In the Middle Ages, those saints were effectively viewed as the superheroes or even celebrities of European society, broadly speaking. They were as much living beings as they were when they were dead. Though ordinary humans, of course, they had performed actions which had made them extraordinary, and they were using their powers in life and in death to help and protect the vulnerable. Saints were, as I say, they were role models of medieval society, people to aspire to look up to. But better still, they offered intercessory powers for the faithful post-mortem. The mechanism, though, of making saints and their role in medieval society began as a system of beliefs and practices in its earliest and most fluid form around 700 AD, when the evolution from honouring the memory of martyrs transformed into their veneration as these intercessors, these miracle workers. Saints were honoured and their help was solicited through devotion towards their very relics, and as well as associated sacred sites with them, even images of them. Deriving from the Latin reliquum, meaning remainder or leftover, the real value of these divine articles, relics, or their authenticity, we might call it, lay in their power as advocates for humankind in bridging between heaven and earth, between the natural and supernatural world. They were essentially the connection between man and woman and the divine. Enamored by all, from princes to paupers, there was a fervent desire for the transfer of bones, relics, just very saintly objects, and this prevailed. So as Carolingian Europe faced a progressively worsening political and social climate, an increasing motivation for contact with these bodies of the holy infiltrated the populace. In effect, when the chips were down, the saints were called upon. Those at the top of the pecking order would work their sacred magic most quickly and effectively, with the power declining the more disconnected the relic was from the associated individual. Yet not all, and this is quite important, not all hallowed heirlooms were considered to be of equal status. So we have the blood of bodies mangled in the hour of martyrdom. We see fingernails and fingers, garments and jewelry ripped from their frames, to other things such as assorted fragments of stone, metallic shavings and masonry chips. All sorts of different objects associated with holy figures were offered as precious relics, with those having direct contact with the blessed individual considered top grade. The blood, bones, and hair of martyrs, apostles, and Christ were of course considered to hold the greatest power. These were known as first-class relics. Of the latter, the most iconic was the cross of Christ's crucifixion. Second-class relics then would include garments or personal property belonging to that holy individual, while third-class relics were objects or places touched by or located within the vicinity of first or these second-class relics. And this is a hierarchy which still exists. So these holy heirlooms then became essentially the lifeblood of religious institutions, as faithful pilgrims began flocking incredible distances to parish churches and cathedrals and even monastery chapels, in order that they could visit saint shrines and the sites of famous Christian deeds for the good of their souls. And as a result, a truly competitive market for them arose. So around the same time as the cult of the saints commenced, the crowning of Charlemagne as Emperor of the Romans in 800 marked the ending of Rome's relationship with most of its suburban shrines. And Charlemagne too ordered that relic veneration was to be an integral part of canon law a year or so after he came to the rule. And as missionaries spread Christianity among Anglians, Saxons, former Slavic subjects, etc., a church wasn't considered to be great without a sacred saintly artifact furnishing its high altar. Essentially, a church without relics was simply no temple to God at all. The saints were most powerful in their relics. And of them all, none performed more miracles or attracted more pilgrims than the physical bones of early Christians, those saints who had pledged their lives to God, the martyrs whose blood was spilled for accepting Christ or his gospel. Their relics were believed to be almost as worthy as possessing the body of Christ himself. Though the great age of martyrs, though, was long past, in the years since the grotesque acts that transformed these faithful men into famous dead, many had become the focal points of these cults of sainthood. And so, relics of despair soon became relics of prosperity, vital to the generation of Christendom's enterprise of faith. Leaving them to rest in peace was difficult, of course, for the sanctuary these objects offered so many people intersected the economic market too at every turn. The problem was that there were only so many bodies that could reasonably pass as saints. Officially sanctioned or accepted relics were always going to be a finite resource, particularly the cream of the crop, the martyrs, as I say, whose remains provided their owners with abundant so-called virtuous credits. And so a shortage ensued. Neither clerics nor pilgrims didn't always act in good faith as a result. There were improper practices and indeed exploitation in some sense, because a torrent of sort of bodily translations or thefts commenced, scandalizing Christendom somewhat in the process. The reason for this is demand was growing, competition was increasing as the remains of particular saints, their venerated bones, and therefore they were gradually being traveled, these bodies, from place to place. Yet traipsing corpses from one location to another, unofficially translating them, was largely condemned, with many making exhortations never to remove the body of a saint from their original sacred resting place, unless, of course, for more official canonization reasons. So much so, in fact, that a great deal of lore and hagiography, or biographies of saints, multiplied, with tales written as warning devices to deter anyone else thinking of committing such crimes against God. But of course, many were also undeterred. Dealers emerged as networks trading in counterfeit saints sprung up in every diocese, and this was a curiously mixed blessing for the church. On the one hand, the wandering bone traffickers and their deceitful acts, which I'll come on to, were polluting the reputation of the church, which obviously was at the heart of daily and spiritual life. Yet on the other hand, the famous dead created a great economic industry, more so perhaps than Christendom had ever really encountered. The pilgrimage trade had an enormous impact on local economies, leading towns to go to extreme lengths in pursuit of the best relics, I suppose we could call them. The most desirable were obviously the most difficult to come by and which would subsequently attract the most visitors. Acquiring prime relics required much time and money as a result. So competition between sacred sites to outdo one another drove many churches to these lengths. Fragments of saints then were trafficked around Europe at alarming rates, but far too often, as I say, simply supply would fall behind demand. So in the quest to acquire them, an underground economy sprang for relics, and it led to a huge business of trading, surreptitiously buying, even stealing of relics. And in fact, this was all very much, these were very much highly organized affairs. And although high-ranking churchmen could technically place orders for relics, churches often couldn't afford to pay the quite astronomical prices of the most prized choices, particularly, the more increasingly pilgrims wanted to see certain saints, sort of hyped up the prices. And so, as a result, they turned to a group known as relic fixers or relic hunters. These various companies of men saw a profit that in transporting relics on order, essentially, what this could offer them. And so many of these groups sprang up and began trading in chunks of bone and human hair and flesh, all the things that we associate with relics, around Europe's greatest churches, some authentic, some not so much. By the 9th century, these middlemen trading in relics and the fame and finance that the possession of famous saints was bringing them encouraged the trade even more. But there was just one problem. As I said, prized remains were hard to come by in great numbers. And without a continuous sort of reserve of these saints, there was more of an issue to get hold of them. Acquiring Roman bodies became the latest necessity, if you will, the martyrs of the saints, and those seen as the most significant, and as did pilgrimages and guided tours to the lost catacombs of Rome. Essentially, Rome was replete with bodies, and I'll come on to this in a moment, as the actual bodily parts of the famous dead then were seen as hot property, with Rome being the source of all this, really. And so if none were already within their possession or buried within their own church, ecclesiastical authorities set about remedying the shortcomings by purchasing remains on the black market. And as I say then, as I've noted, many had to turn to Rome This was, of course, the holy city of the West, the seat of the visible head of the Catholic Church since Pope Gregory the Great commenced after his election to the bishopric in 590. And it was the shrine of the princes of the apostles, Peter and Paul, the pillars of the church. Alongside Jerusalem and Santiago de Compostela in Spain, Rome was the holiest place on earth. But it was equally a vast necropolis, piled with more assorted bodies and artifacts of saints than almost anywhere else in Christendom. Clogging the pastures and deserted hills of the surrounding countryside and below the city itself too, but largely just beyond the original boundaries of the city, was cemeteries from the age of the emperors known as the catacombs. And as I say, they had so many bodies, including some of Christianity's most revered sacrifices. This was an integral part of the ancient city's irreplaceable heritage. And of course, back in the 4th century, former Pontiff Damasus had relaxed old regulations that prohibited the removal of these holy dead and reopened these Roman catacombs. The catacombs themselves, though, were buried deep within and below often their associated churches. They were often double-storied complexes of interlinked chapels and courtyards, safe for any, well, supposedly safe from any grasping hands, or so they thought. The treasures of Italy's long-perished heroes and villains, too, were stored away in these macabre stone libraries, each chamber stacked upon one another. They're amazing to visit, though. Attracting an unenviable notoriety, the most infamous of these professional relic hunters or relic merchants who set about garnering relics for patrons was from 9th century. He was a Roman deacon named Deusdedon, and his band of brothers too, who sort of somewhat struck gold in the ruined and deserted catacombs beneath Rome's ancient streets. And two, he lived near the Basilica of St. Peter in Chains, and to its abandoned catacombs. So Deusdedon became the ultimate relic monger. Vowing to capitalize on the opportunity that these martyrs and saints, the remains of them, supplied, these men trafficked random bodies, though, and fragmented bodily parts as a result. They would often pass off who they could find, and I'll come on to how in a minute, as those of the most blessed saints, along other holy antiques too they traded in, but they were passing them off or trying to across the borders of Christendom to establish the medieval world's largest network of relic touting, even enduring battle with anyone who dared threaten their enterprise. And along with his brothers and associates, Deusdedon ran a sort of highly organized ring, which was particularly famous or infamous for selling at least 5 saints to the Benedictine monastery at Fulda in Germany, including the saints Urban and Fabian, but most prominently for their acquisition of saints Marcellinus and Peter, who were both martyrs during the early Roman Empire. And this was on order, these saints were on order for Einhard, who was the private secretary to Charlemagne and his son Louis the Pious. And they were ordered in order to endow Louis's newly founded monastery at Mullenheim. After visiting the imperial city of Aachen then to speak with Einhard, Deusdedon offered him the relics in exchange for a mule. After perhaps the most complex relic heist of the 9th century then ensued, he would return with them sometime later to Einhard, making sure though to gain other customers and swindle other relic bearers along the way. No record exists though for his capture, or indeed any of his associates, etc. So it can be assumed that their profitable gang of relic hunters, profitable smuggling business too, continued right up until their deaths. But they were not alone in the trade, of course. There's the famous story in 828 of 2 Venetian merchants who questioned the appropriateness of the body of the Apostle Mark remaining in a Muslim-occupied city, which was Alexandria in Egypt. And after stealing it, the body was cloaked in joints of pork to deter the Islamic excisemen from searching their ship, which they managed to do so, and they managed to bring his body back to Venice successfully. And in fact, other notorious merchants included Deusdedon's direct competitor, who was a Frankish cleric named Felix. And he was recorded often selling the same relics as his rival. In fact, both men openly admitted to stealing said relics and were even protected sometimes by their clerical customers, who were aided their escape from the pursuing communities from which the relics had been stolen in the first place. So it was an interesting sort of dichotomy between different communities. And over in England too, similar practices occurred and still have occurred until quite recently. In 869, England was about to fall foul to a great heathen force of Danes, led by essentially who we now know as either the Boneless and Arber. As they pillaged their way through the country, they landed upon the kingdom of East Anglia, and there at Thetford seized its ruler, Edmund. Refusing to govern though as a Viking underking, Edmund was allegedly tied to a tree and beaten before his final breath was taken by a volley of arrows. But his body was not yet spared of torment. His head was subsequently hacked off and tossed into a bramble bush. Edmund was the last of the Withering dynasty of East Anglia, and while possibly fabricated by later chronicles, the Danes then allegedly performed the ghastly blood eagle on him, a rite in which the living victim had his ribs and lungs spread apart like eagle's wings. And he was buried in the nearby town of what is now Bury St. Edmunds and canonized a short time later. Such was his following, though, that Edmund was soon recognized as England's patron saint, a position which he held until he was overthrown by St. George on Edward III's orders in the 15th century. But after King John reneged on Magna Carta, the country fell into civil war as the so-called Barons' War broke out. John died in 1216 with the throne passing to his 9-year-old son, Henry III. But to overcome stalemate, the barons offered the throne of England to Louis, the Dauphin of France, later Louis VIII. Alas, England was not to become part of France. But with the success of royalist forces, Louis allegedly wreaked vengeance. He returned home with England's most precious national treasure, the body of the saint, who would become the traditional protector of the people's rights, Edmund. But in 1901, the Archbishop of Westminster requested the relics return so that they might grace the high altar of the new cathedral, as we have heard was custom for any new altar. But Toulouse, where the relics had supposedly been housed, refused to do so, refused to give them back. On appeal, though, the Pope sided with the Archbishop, and Edmund's body was returned to England, to the seat of the Duke of Norfolk at Arundel, at least temporarily. And yet his decapitated head remained in France. Yet following doubt over the authenticity of the relics sent back, and this continues on actually to this day, his bodily remains have been left in the care of the Duke of Norfolk in his private chapel, supposedly at Arundel. However, robbery was not the only practice through which relics might abound. These easily transported, largely untraceable in some cases, objects were often difficult to verify as authentic relics, unless they proved themselves, of course, through miracles, through miracle working powers. And of course, this therefore enabled double selling if the monger, the relic monger, was talented or duplicitous enough. Thus, the replication of relics could run into the double digits. The traffic in bones of saints or other so-called holy antiques became so prevalent that churches were often found to be overflowing with some bogus relics. Now, although the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 ordered pilgrims, quote, not to be deceived by lying stories or false documents, end quote, problems, however, persisted. The biggest clue that relics were fake came when several sites laid claim to the same relic, leading to more than one, often numerous, versions of that same relic. Countless sites claimed pieces of wood as shards of the true cross, with no less than 29 claiming to house the associated nails of the cross. Although we often believe there to have been 3, the earliest crucifixes show the Saviour's feet separated, so perhaps 4. But Apocrypha also claims that St. Helena had a further 12 made out of the original 4 nails, which may go some way to explaining why there's still so many on display. Nonetheless, the Venetians claim to possess the original 3, but if in reality, if pieced back together, Christ was obviously crucified on quite a large cross. So it's interesting how this all occurred. It's important to note here, though, that often when human remains were accidentally discovered near a church or the catacombs, they were often promoted as the body of a martyr, as were nearby sites and objects, artifacts. And in some cases, there's little evidence of deliberate fraud or manipulation attempts, actually. The custom of making facsimiles, in fact, it's a custom which still continues to this day in the form of replicas or souvenirs. I mean, we have, for example, St. John the Baptist's head at Amiens Cathedral, or the replica of the Turin Shroud in Philadelphia. A lot of this sort of process or practice may account for the many relics which swarmed the great medieval churches, which were often seen as counterfeit. For example, a similar tale of this sort of thing derives from Glastonbury Abbey. When they were struggling to acquire funds to rebuild their church in the late 12th century and to compete with Westminster Abbey and various other neighbours, the monks just so happened to stumble upon the skeletons of King Arthur and Guinevere in a tree trunk within their precinct. They relocated the grave into the grounds of the Abbey's new church, and the site subsequently thrived. But it was all perhaps a ruse to promote their new church above the upcoming newfangled pilgrim sites, their rival sites. And as a consequence, in fact, nearby Wells Cathedral was seemingly deserted by its pilgrims, who now flocked to the newly prized relics on display at Glastonbury. Yet, of course, this was not to say that quarrelling parties who laid claim to the same supposedly authentic relic could not be held accountable or seek help in their justification. By scouring records and thus establishing the alleged true history of the relics, and of course they could be thrown into fire or water too, that was another way of testing them, and the indisputable verification of them, as I've said, including two associated performed cures and miracles, which they had to do in order to be authentic, warring claims between sites could be put to rest by the offices of the Holy See. Peddlers of suspicious relics could then be subjected to this authenticating practice. And as I say, they would submerge the relics in boiling water, for example, in order to test its veracity. Or another rather more elementary example comes from Pope Innocent III from the turn of the 13th century, who, when asked which of the three churches possessed the real foreskin of Christ, known as the Holy Prepuce, he asserted, quote, that rather than attempt rash answers to such questions, it's better that they be left entirely to God, end quote. Nevertheless, papal records held multiple accounts of the same saints, so the risk for many merchants and touters was somewhat minimal and the rewards quite high, that it was often too tempting to turn most requests for orders for relics away. And it thus becomes rather simple to understand why we have the multiplicity and extravagance of the entries in the many relic inventories of the churches across Christendom in the medieval era. All in all, though, the calamitous fraud or greed which ensued throughout the Middle Ages derived from the simple acute rivalry between religious institutions and the desire to be known as the keeper of the most extraordinary, miraculous relic collection. And of course, we have, though, comments on all of this. Even Chaucer's pardoner in the late 14th century Canterbury Tales was viewed as a peddler of phony relics, and he had the veil of the Virgin Mary, supposedly, but it was actually an old pillowcase, and his bag of old pig bones was passed off as ancient saints, and supposedly he was fleecing the gullible. But it was only a century or two later that the cult of the saints and its associated economy and materialism suffered quite a major public relations scandal. Firstly, arguably through the German theologian Martin Luther, and he orated that, quote, what lies there are about relics? How does it happen that 18 apostles are buried in Germany when Christ had only 12, he asked. And to Protestant reformer John Calvin, who claimed that if brought under one roof, quote, it would be made manifest that every apostle has more than 4 bodies and every saint 2 or 3. So there's a real sort of awareness of this problem within the church at this time. And in fact, unsurprisingly, by the 15th century, skepticism over the deceitful practices behind relic culture was brought into the spotlight by Protestant reformers who were desperate to expose the wrongdoings of the Catholic Church. Many relics were actually proven to be forgeries. That much is true, and some were proven to be duck's blood, spice or herb concoctions such as the blood of hails, animal bones. Of course, there may be bias on both sides. Yet, of course, they continued to be venerated by many, and they were still seen as imbued with divine powers that could transform or cure. Beginning in the 1520s, though, Europe perhaps saw quite a fundamental change to this belief, and a movement marked at its heart by an attack on devotion to the saints. In England, we saw in the mid-1530s, Henry VIII attack pilgrimage, relics, reliquary shrines, and the veneration of images by and large, and even more so by his son, Edward VI, later. To believe that relics had any kind of implanted sacredness was somewhat equivalent to heathen idolatry, and in turn, shrines, tombs, reliquaries of saints were smashed open and remains thrown into charnel houses in some cases. Some were burnt, some were hidden, of course, and with the more valuable materials melted down or transformed into supposedly secular or non-religious artifacts. Statues too, we know, were decimated and burned. Wall and rood paintings were defaced and or covered with whitewash, then overwritten with what was claimed now as the only sanctified relic, the Word of God. The priests at the shrines were then branded liars in many cases, who were committing fraud and robbery, and now the replication of relics was seen also as proof of their absurdity. In 1561, Genevan reformer Jean Calvin explained that they merely surmounted to, quote, dust and heaps of foolish trifles. In fact, he continues with John in his treatise in relics, that indeed the only reason why there are so many false and imaginary relics is that God has permitted the world to be doubly deceived and fallen, since it has so loved deceit and lies. Rather than public veneration, many extravagant and unusual relics and reliquaries actually found their way into some safety. They found their way into many private collections as the centuries drew on, though the trade in unsanctioned relics vastly waned come the 19th century, once the Enlightenment period had passed. The veritable spoils of the Reformation were now a sort of must-have accessories of every elite household, behind closed doors often, or even some reliquaries were turned into what was viewed as non-religious objects. Essentially, they were hidden within new containers, etc. And still, the Catholic Church continued the requirement for all altars to house relics until as late as 1969. So that just shows how important they still are. But I just also wanted to finish this by going through a couple of these, of perhaps the most interesting relics, some of which, well, all of which technically are still on display. Preserved in the Basilica Cateriniana, San Domenico in Siena, the mummified head of St. Catherine of Siena is housed behind a locked, gilded grate. She's one of Italy's two patron saints and known for her incredible religious visions, and died in Rome in 1380 at the age of 33, we think, shortly after suffering a major stroke. When the people of Siena requested her body for burial, the request was denied. A group of her followers decided to undertake the clandestine task of arranging for her head to be removed and returned to Siena. When the body snatchers were apprehended, guards found only rose petals inside their bag. It was only when the head was delivered back to Siena that the rose petals magically morphed back into Catherine's head. So she had deceived them. Following the Jewish rite, then, we also have supposedly Jesus' circumcision, which occurred 8 days after his birth, and therefore begs the question of what became of his foreskin. As perhaps the most valuable and holy relic, since it was an actual bodily part of Christ, several figures and churches claimed its possession. Its first mention appears to come when Charlemagne presented it as a gift to Pope Leo III after an angel allegedly gave the relic to the emperor in the first place. Soon, rival claimants began to spring up across Europe, and all told, at least 31 churches in Europe asserted to house the Holy Foreskin sometime during the Middle Ages, including in Paris, Compostela, and Toulouse, often at the same time. One of the most sought after Christian relics, though, Salome famously requested Herod bring her the head of John the Baptist on a platter. But where John's severed head or the rest of his body ended up, no one quite knows, presumably buried by the Saracens. No fewer than 4 locations lay claim to it, said to be housed in a shrine in Damascus in Syria. A skull identified as John's head is on display at the church of San Silvestro in Rome. Amiens Cathedral was built to house the shrine, or a shrine for the Baptist's head, after a crusader supposedly returned it from Constantinople in 1206. And a replica of the relic is still kept there, although the original was stolen in the 19th century. And in Munich, Germany, the Residence Museum includes John's skull among a number of other relics collected by Duke Wilhelm V of Bavaria. Alleged to have legally hidden Jesuit priests in her home in the York Shambles, Margaret Clitheroe, which is the next relic here, was put to death on the 25th of March 1586 by Painfort et Dieu at the toll booth on the Ouse Bridge. There she was laid naked, a door placed over her, and stone weights piled on top. 6 weeks later, her body was taken by her executioners to be buried at midnight in an obscure corner of the city where no one would find it. After embalming, she was then reburied. The secret of her burial place was so closely guarded it's seemingly lost, but it's alleged to have been interred in the crypt of a small chapel of St. Saviour in Stidden, Lancashire. Still, one of her hands, which was supposedly detached before her final burial, is now one of the most precious treasures on display at the Bar Convent in York. And finally, we have St. Anthony, who perished from edema in 1231, but when he was exhumed in 1263, in order to be reburied in a grand new basilica, his body was found to be decomposed, except for, curiously, just his tongue. After death, of course, the tongue is the part of our body which should, in theory, decay first. It's the most fragile and it's moist. It's therefore significant that precisely this part of the saint's body of Anthony should be one of the best preserved. And so this was taken, of course, as a miraculous sign of his speaking and teaching about the word of God during his lifetime. Anthony's canonization was one of the fastest on record, about less than 12 months. Special reliquaries were thus crafted, which are permanently housed in the chapel of the relics of Padua's Basilico del Santo. The rest of his remains are entombed in a separate chapel. And in 1981, his body was again exhumed, and scientists discovered that the tissue supporting the vocal cords, along with other organic material connected with his vocal apparatus, was still remarkably preserved. Thank you, everyone.
Emma, thank you very, very much for that. I'm sorry, I've got some dogs fighting at the moment that I'm trying to keep under control. Emma, thank you so much. That was fascinating. I suppose we should say that, you know, relics are still venerated in the Roman Catholic and indeed in the Anglican Church. You know, it's not just Roman Catholics who venerate relics. I can think of plenty of people in the Church of England who use it, and even still in Anglican cathedrals in England. Isn't it the case that shrines are being rebuilt today?
Arguably, of course, perhaps in a slightly different way, but I think this is the point. We still had we still have pilgrimage, arguably, after the 16th century. There was pilgrimage right up in the 19th century. So although technically outlawed during the injunctions of the 1530s, none of this has been completely forgotten about. And this is still very much a part of both Anglican and Catholic culture, of course. Absolutely, yeah.
And I think, you know, the other thing is that also that relics, modern relics of saints are still being created. I know, I think it was last week we had the feast of St. John Henry Newman. So there's been relics with his, which is quite interesting. So when he was buried, he asked for limes to be put over him, so they couldn't make relics, but they have got some. But I'm also thinking even St. John Paul II, that bullet. If you go to Fatima, everyone, you know, when, on the assassination attempt on St. John Paul II's life, a year later he goes to Fatima holding the bullet that he was hit twice, once in the hand and one in the abdomen, if I remember. And he takes Fatima, and if you go and see the crown on top of Our Lady's head, the crown holds now that bullet that hit John Paul II. But it's a fascinating topic to study, isn't it, Emma?
Absolutely. And I think this is the point, is relics are, and we have this sort of grade of relics of first class, second class, and third as well. And as you're saying, if it is a body part, or if it is something they have touched, they're first or second class relics, and they are still very much venerated today as much as they were in the medieval era, both by Anglicans and Catholics in different ways, because these are mementos, these are parts of these people, not only them, but also their history and why they are such holy beings. This is the entire point. Yeah.
And I should also add, but also it's not just in terms of Western Christianity, Eastern Christianity as well have relics. I can remember doing a choir tour when I was young, and I was a chorister going to Cyprus, and there's a little boy going over, I think it wasn't Bellapay, it was to a little chapel where the tomb of St. Barnabas was, and you go in and there's this little glass, and we all had to kiss this glass, and underneath it was the skull. And it's very interesting, is that you've got different approaches to particularly in Eastern and Western Christianity, and actually some people actually go and touch the relics, where some people don't need, some people, it's very much kept separate, that, you know, there's a shrine, you can pray in front of it, but in particularly, I'm thinking, you know, particularly also in the East, where you've got icons, where you will touch the icons, kiss the icon. It's a much more physical relationship, isn't it?
I mean, that derives really too in Christianity, the sort of Catholic experience of relics, and even to this day, because it hasn't really changed, but the idea was that the closer you were to a relic, the greater and quicker that the intercessory power would work. You know, it's that being close to sanctity, and that's why we have some of the great shrines and tombs which had portal-esque openings, these foramina tombs, and the great niches in the tombs, so that you can not only pray at the shrine structure itself, but get as close as you could to the reliquary casket. That was the point. And then they had great covers that would reveal the coffins and whatever instead. So kissing, touching, licking to ingesting relics is all part and parcel of this. It's a very much a sensory and corporeal affair.
And I suppose also, Emma, you know, when we go, for those people, if you haven't been, I do recommend go to Canterbury Cathedral, and you've got those steps, don't you? And you can see how worn the steps are. You can see where people crawled, and particularly where you go to some tombs, you can see where people have put their hands into it, and just how worn down they all are. All the stones, aren't they?
Yeah, and I've just been doing a lecture series at Ripon Cathedral, and obviously there's the crypt there, which has seen, you know, over 1,000 years of visitors, and you can see by the patina, you can see just how many hands have touched the patina as you leave or as you enter, depending on now or then. And this is the point. It is such a corporeal sensory experience, is the cult of relics and the cult of saints. It was the closer you were, the better, essentially. Yeah.
Thanks. I'm sorry, everyone, for the dogs fighting.
I'm trying not to.
Yeah, I don't. They're certainly not going to get a dentist if they don't stop it. Right, I'm going to plow on some questions here. So Emma, a quick easy one is, someone's asked, what are the cloisters behind you?
Oh gosh, I knew someone was going to ask this. It's Spain or Portugal, and I can't remember which one it is. But I'll remember for next time when I do this. And it's not England. I can tell you, it's not England.
Thanks, Emma. And
purchase.
It's very effective. A question I think is a really interesting question is, obviously we've talked about relics, and I can remember when I worked at Ely, the story about the monks at Ely going to nearby March and stealing the remains of St. Etheldreda's sister and trying to bring her to March. But what kind of protection was given to holy sites to prevent relics being stolen or indeed replaced with forgeries?
Well, that's a good question. That's a really great question. And in fact, I'm doing research into this. So I sort of want to say, hold that thought. But I suppose that, I mean, it's not as though there were relic merchants coming into great cathedrals and smashing shrines or reliquaries to gain, well, not really, not until obviously the 16th century, to get you know, fragments of bone or whatever it was. It's more so that, as we know, if they were in catacombs, if they were in far more easily accessible places, that these orders could occur, essentially. But I mean, we also have to be very careful, even when we're talking about Canterbury Cathedral, that it's not as though pilgrims like they do today, or visitors like they do today, are freely entering around the church in order to get to the tomb of St. Thomas Becket, to the shrine of St. Thomas Becket, and wherever else. Firstly, it's far more elite visitors are accessing the Eastern End on a far more regular basis, or particular feast days. And there were so many gates and as I say, specified routes. So it's quite Fort Knox, if you will, anyway. Cathedrals were quite Fort Knox-like in the medieval era. So there isn't the need for that, so to speak, if that makes some sort of sense. But if I come across any sort of particular safety measures anywhere, I will let you know. Good question.
Yeah, that was a great question. And on to the next one. Regarding false relics, what are your thoughts about the presence of animal bones mixed in with human relics? At St. Magnus in Orkney, a casket of bones believed to be those of the saint also included goose bones. Would this have shown an intention to be fraudulent, or could there be another explanation, e.g. decoy bones that could be taken if the relics were vulnerable to theft?
Yeah, they found this as well with, oh gosh, is it St. Brigitte? She was buried in a cave, or it will come back to me. Which I think it was found to be goat bones. And as I say, Hales, the blood of Hales was found to be a concoction of saffron and oils, etc. I suppose, yes, I think that's a really interesting question, in that's the problem is when we need to ask ourselves when this was discovered. So are we talking about during the Reformation, essentially, or the Reformation era, when they were supposedly found to be animal bones? Because obviously there's a far more, I suppose, nefarious underpinnings to why you might want to say a relic is not authentic and it is simply an animal bone. But if we're talking today, when we do find sort of things mixed in, it certainly could be because, as we think perhaps with St. Thomas Becket's relics, that they were buried, and no doubt many of the great saints were actually reburied and buried elsewhere. So in effect, you could essentially get them mixed in with all different kinds of bones. So I think we look at this on a case-by-case basis, ask when is this recorded, ask who is recording this and why. So I think it's certainly possible, and I think certainly decoys too are possible. And in fact, other saints or other bodies as well that aren't the original saints too. Yeah.
Thanks for your thoughts on that, Emma. And there's certainly some very interesting different ideas there. And I think you hit the nail that it could be a multiple in different cases and different situations, having different answers to that. Is there a scientific way of proving whether relics are genuine to their namesake?
I mean, difficult. I suppose what you can look at is sort of carbon-14 or DNA, the sort of modern scientific techniques, and you can say, does that bone date from the era in which the person was alive? So you can narrow it down. So I suppose we have to put far more emphasis on I don't want to say circumstantial evidence, but I suppose really, if a shrine or if a reliquary we know hasn't really been opened, we can therefore assume it is who the said person was. And we do still test relics to this day. We've done it with the Turin shroud, etc., etc. So it's essentially putting lots of different techniques. Historians, archaeologists, scientists, biologists, etc., all using their techniques, putting them together in a sort of interdisciplinary manner to say, is this likely to be X person? And that's, it's more difficult to really verify that is so-and-so person, really. But we can do it, I suppose. We've seen it with Richard, King Richard, so, it's possible.
Thanks, Emma. And I'm going to merge a couple of questions here, because I think this is quite interesting. Which relics still surviving are considered the most powerful healing relics? Or is it a case you think that instead of relics, it could be particular shrines? So I'm just thinking of places like Lourdes, Fatima, Walsingham. Are they more, have they got more resonance, do you think, with miracles?
I mean, it's a sort of a difficult question to answer, really, because there are obviously shrines of saints that are, or sites themselves that are more popular. It's, yes, and I suppose Walsingham is, England's Nazareth, and there are hundreds of thousands of pilgrims visiting there. So the issue is essentially, are we talking today? Are we talking in the medieval era, etc.? So we have to look at it that way. And of course, we had Rome, we had Santiago, etc., and Jerusalem, of course. And then in England, we had Canterbury, we had Walsingham, as I say, but prior to Canterbury, there was also Durham, St. Cuthbert, who was the #1 saint. So yes, there's a sort of gradation or hierarchy of saints and the amount of miracles they have performed, but also saints have different purposes. So it depends what what you're visiting that particular saint for. But also we have to remember too that, and I've said this in quite a few of my talks, that the great long arduous pilgrim journeys were more once in a lifetime. So you were going those probably once within your entire lifespan, whereas you could go to your local church on a more regular basis if you had, I don't know, a broken leg and you needed some intercession, or you had a bad harvest, you would do that. So yes, but again, we need to ask ourselves why they are still popular. And obviously Lourdes, etc., and Walsingham, Catholic, that's a Catholic shrine, whereas we still do have more Anglican, which are technically Anglican cathedrals now, that still have their own relics too. So it's complicated.
Thanks, Emma. And I think it's quite interesting, particularly if you go, I think there's some misconception when people say about miracles happen. Actually, the Roman Catholic Church has really strong policies in place and procedure in place to prove miracles. So I know at Lourdes, they have independent medical, examiners who have to verify things. So there's quite a lot of scrutiny around miracles and relics. They aren't there.
Yeah, and the canonization of saints. I mean, it's I want to say 6-stage process. I have written an article about this because it's become a little bit more complex. But yeah, there's commissions for, essentially identifying if someone has performed. I believe you have to have 2 relics in order to be considered a saint now. Fully a saint, you go from venerable, blessed, etc., beatified, etc. So I believe it's 2 now, and yeah, there are specific scientific commissions that sit, or scientific bodies that sit and say this can be authenticated as a miracle. Therefore, this person can be canonized. And it happened with Newman most recently.
Thank you, Emma. And I'm going to ask, there's a question that's come here about someone, I don't know if this person could talk about, I think it's about a Greek island they're talking about, but someone being carried through the streets in a glass coffin. I can't remember which Greek islands they were on, but they saw this. So I suppose this comes down to this whole idea about also between the living and the dead, actually, bodies of saints being paraded around towns. It's that kind of liminality between the living and the dead. Actually, they're very much part of the faithful's lives today, aren't they?
Absolutely. And again, this goes right back to the medieval era and before, particularly sort of head shrines as well were really commonly sort of traipsed around the bounds of a parish or the bounds of a diocese, from church to church, essentially, as not only, I mean, to be honest, it was, of course, a fundraising mission. You needed money for your local cathedral or your local great church or monastery, etc. And therefore it was by all means a fundraising event, but it also allowed those who couldn't get to their local cathedral to visit their shrine, to visit their saint, in order to, it allowed them to gain that intercessory power to worship, venerate that particular saint. So they could physically, usually they were housed in tents overnight within particular parishes, and you might enter, we're not sure if they sort of visited in the tent or they actually came out and visited that way. But yeah, and usually on Rogation tide processions as well, they'd bring out the head shrine or whatever and parade them around the parishes and dioceses. So very much a part, and still to this day, it still goes on. Yeah.
And there's a question I think is a really important point too, because it's quite a misconception, I think, that we should clear up here, is that with relics, is it the saint who causes the miracle, or is it the saint's intercession that causes the miracle?
It's the saint's saint's intercessory power which causes the miracle. But I suppose that's very interesting, this is the chicken and the egg. But of course, when it's the saint's intercessory power, which is why they are a saint. I suppose you wouldn't be a saint without the intercessory power. So I suppose that is the point, but it is the intercessory power. And this is why you have to be careful, of course, when we get into the issue of iconoclasm, etc. And this is why that we are venerating those who are the power of those rather than the person itself. Usually that's sort of the point here. Yes.
And it's true, isn't it, that certain saints and certain relics of saints had certain, or what it was believed that they would have more efficacy in treating certain ailments, isn't it? I'm thinking even today, if people in London, if you ever go to St. Magnus the Martyr on St. Blaise's Day, you will see that they have this thing where they put on your neck sort of these candles, and because St. Blaise was for throats. Was there a particular, with people in the Middle Ages, if they had particular ailments, would they go to specific shrines because they felt they would get a cure at that shrine?
Yeah, this is what I was talking about earlier is, yes, if you had a particular problem or you needed some intercession on your behalf, you would, I mean, particularly obviously Little Walsingham, Shrine of Our Lady, and therefore lots of things to do with fertility, etc., etc. But this is the point, is you might just be going to your more local saint because you couldn't get all the way to Walsingham or Canterbury or Jerusalem or whatever. So yes, I think absolutely people were going for specific reasons. And, you know, if you were, I don't know, having trouble conceiving or something like that, you might make that particular pilgrimage to that particular saint, or, you know, whatever was the issue that you needed fixing at the time. But it was far more of an everyday practice too, in order to go and visit your local saint in order for their aid, in order for their help on a daily basis as well, because, you know, they didn't have the sort of Western medicine that we do now, etc. So that was what you would do.
And I think we've got time for one final question, Emma. It's due to, obviously, we talked about particularly about focus a lot on early medieval relics and obviously in the high Middle Ages looking at relics. But do you think today pop stars and the like have almost become the new cult of saints, where people want a bit of that pop star? What, you know, I could think, you know, going to museums where, you know, the royal family, people wanted a bit of Prince Diana's dress or a bit of this celebrity's hair. Do you think you know, the cult of the celebrity has become the modern day version of the cult of the saint?
Yeah, I actually wrote an article about this a little while ago, and it started with William Shatner's kidney being sold for, I want to say it was something like $58,000. Yeah. And there's been Marilyn Monroe's lipstick, and there's gum from celebrities and things like that. So this is the thing, these are mementos of people we sort of view as significant or great in various ways. And to many people, celebrities and pop stars are the sort of famous dead, as the saints were the celebrities of the Middle Ages. So I think, yes, it's all about the idea of, as we said, reliquum, of relics being leftovers, of mementos. And we still see this too with wayside shrines of, you know, just any person in the world who might have died in a tragic way. And we see this with, again, obviously with pop stars and rock stars too. But I think that idea of connecting with someone who's passed by any means that they have, or any remains that they have left on earth, continues and is just as important and significant to this day. Yeah.
Thank you, Emma, and thank you everyone for your questions today. That's given a lot of food for, and I think looking by the questions, I'm going to have to get something about incorruptible saints, a lecture on that in future, Emma. But everyone, thank you so much for your questions. Do keep an eye on your shop, by the way, because we're going to be selling Emma's book about pilgrim routes, and I'm really excited. Well, I'll let Emma come back in a minute, and she can tell you about her new book that's going to be released next year. So, Emma, do you want to tell everyone about your new book that's coming out?
Yes, it's entitled Heaven on Earth, The Lives and Legacies of the Greatest Cathedrals. But it's really about the most interesting, of course, all cathedrals are great, of course, but the most interesting construction tales and the people, really, the great people behind those great buildings, largely centered around the Gothic cathedral. I suppose that's arguably what we tend to associate with medieval cathedrals today, although, you know, I do stray into slightly later, and we do. And it's not just Europe, we look at the Hagia Sophia, for example, and we look at Russia, but it's really the people and really those very interesting tales about how and why and who funded them, and the sort of stories that you don't see. It's not an architectural history by any means, although of course I look at the history of the architecture, but the people behind them, which I think just hasn't really been looked at before.
Thanks, Emma. And everyone, I've booked Emma to do a book launch for us. So she's going to be on the day it's published. She'll be doing a special lecture with us for that. So you'll be able to tune. And we're also working on something else, but I will tell you all about that shortly. And that's a secret that we're working on at the moment. So keep your eyes tuned. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Next week, it's our final lecture in our October spooky series. So next week, we're joined by Dr. Francis Young, who's done several lectures with us also before. He's a folklore historian, and he's going to be talking to us about the history of exorcism in England. He's written several books on it. It's going to be a very interesting topic, looking at the academic history of the liturgy and rites of exorcism in England. So do join us at the same time next Thursday for that. Do also please comment away with your suggestions. I've really enjoyed getting emails from everyone. And if you want to email me, you can email me at digital@thecct.org.uk. But I've really enjoyed getting your suggestions. I know I've got a few more I've got to reply to, but I am taking them seriously. I've already got booked on the back of some people's recommendations lectures for next year, which will I think you'll be really excited about. But do keep those suggestions coming. Really appreciate them. But also tonight I'm driving up to Shrewsbury to our church there, where I'm going to be doing some filming tomorrow. And I'll be doing a live stream tomorrow, or hopefully a couple of live streams. So do keep an eye on our Facebook page, because I will be trying to show you some of the treasures in that church, particularly the fantastic collection of medieval stained glass. It has some of the most important medieval stained glass in England in that church. So I'll be talking to you a bit about that on the live stream with our local community officer there, Robert Milton. So do keep an eye out on our Facebook page for that. But everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you've enjoyed this lecture. If it's been your first time, do let us know. But as I said at the start of the lecture, please do consider making a donation to support our work. If you're enjoying this lecture, they're completely free of charge, but do consider sending a text donation. So you can text CCT to 70331 to give us a gift of £3. You can donate through our website, which is visitchurches.org.uk. Or, as I said, you can become a member with us. And membership starts at just £3.50 a month. So the price of a cup of coffee, or even cheaper actually, because I got some the other day and it wasn't £3.50, it was a lot more expensive than that. But as I say, if you join us by direct debit and use the offer code lecture in capitals, you'll get a free copy of The Secret Language of Churches and Cathedrals. And I'm really excited because Dr. Richard Semp is coming back in several weeks' time to do a follow-up lecture, which will tie in with this book. And it's a sequel to the lecture he did earlier this year on the Scrivini Chapel in Padua. So I hope everyone's enjoyed today's lecture. I hope you have a great weekend, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you at a future lunchtime lecture. Take care, everyone, and thank you again to Emma.
Thank you.